ਦ ਵੇ ਫਾਰਵਰਡ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਬਹੁਤ-ਬਹੁਤ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਹੋਸਟ ਹਰਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ। ਅਸੀਂ ਹਾਲੇ ਵੀ ਇਸ ਮੁਲਕ ਵਿੱਚ ਨਵੇਂ ਹਾਂ, ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਇਸ ਮੁਲਕ ਦੇ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਨੂੰ ਜਾਣਨਾ ਸਮਝਣਾ ਸਾਡੇ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਹੈ। ਇਸ ਮੁਲਕ ਦੇ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਨਾਲ ਇੱਕ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਐਲੀਮੈਂਟ ਜੁੜਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਹੈਗਾ ਰੇਸ ਦਾ, ਰੇਸਿਜ਼ਮ ਦਾ, ਔਰ ਇੱਕ ਬਲੈਕ ਸਪੌਟ ਇਜ਼ ਦੀ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਸਲੇਵਰੀ ਦਾ। ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਜੈਦੀਪ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ ਨਾਲ, ਜੋ ਕਿ ਰੇਸ ਨੂੰ ਔਰ ਰਿਲੀਜੀਅਸ ਬਾਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਕੰਟੈਂਪਰੇਰੀ ਪੋਲੀਟਿਕਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਪੜ੍ਹਦੇ ਨੇ, ਸਮਝਦੇ ਨੇ। ਉਹ ਇੱਕ ਹਿਸਟੋਰੀਅਨ ਹਨ, ਕੈਲੀਫੋਰਨੀਆ ਸਟੇਟ ਯੂਨੀਵਰਸਿਟੀ 'ਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਸਰਵ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ। ਔਰ ਅੱਜ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇਹ ਸਲੇਵਰੀ ਦੀ ਬੈਕਗਰਾਊਂਡ ਹੈ, ਰੇਸਿਜ਼ਮ ਦੀ ਬੈਕਗਰਾਊਂਡ ਹੈ, ਔਰ ਅੱਜ ਦੀ ਡੇਟ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਸਾਡੀ ਲਾਈਫ ਨੂੰ ਇਨਫਲੂਐਂਸ ਕਰਦੀ ਹੈ ਇਸ ਕੰਟਰੀ ਵਿੱਚ, ਉਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ। ਜੈਦੀਪ ਜੀ, ਵੈਲਕਮ ਟੂ ਦ ਵੇ ਫਾਰਵਰਡ।
Sat Sri Akal ji, thank you for having me, and I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss such a salient topic at this time in American history. And I just want to apologize to everybody. My Punjabi is pretty bad. I migrated to this country in 1972 at the age of 3, and unfortunately, my parents didn't. Well, maybe fortunately, I came here. I didn't speak English, and so I had to learn quickly. And so my parents made a decision to make sure that I spoke English. And so I apologize that my presentation today will be in English.
Jaideep ji, no need to apologize. Asi samajhde hain, this is our new reality. This is a reality we have to accept and live with. Jaideep ji, the topic that we're discussing today, racism, slavery, it's a very important topic. Some people argue that slavery is a thing of the past. It is something that this country has left behind. From time to time, we see that the impressions from those times come and haunt us again. I don't think that we have completely left it behind, but ਸਾਡੀ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਜਾਣਨਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਅੱਜ ਦੀ ਡੇਟ ਵਿੱਚ ਜੋ ਫਰੀਡਮਸ, ਜੋ ਸਕਸੈਸ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਕੰਟਰੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੰਜੋਏ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਜੋ ਕੰਫਰਟਸ ਅਸੀਂ ਇੰਜੋਏ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਉਹ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਨ ਅਫਰੀਕਨ ਅਮੈਰੀਕਨਸ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਟਰਗਲ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਸੈਕਰੀਫਾਈਸਿਸ ਹਨ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਉੱਪਰ ਉਹ ਸਾਡੀ ਅੱਜ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਫਰੀਡਮਸ ਹਨ, ਸਾਡੀ ਵੈਰੀ ਐਗਜ਼ਿਸਟੈਂਸ ਇਨ ਦਿਸ ਕੰਟਰੀ, ਉਸ ਦੇ ਉੱਪਰ ਬੇਸਡ ਹੈ। Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, because the reality is African Americans were the first large group to live among the newly created white society in this country that was created in the 1770s. Gee. And every form of degradation that could possibly be heaped on human beings has been suffered by African Americans in this country. Now, because they fought for generations and generations against this, we, as recent arrivals, have become the beneficiaries of African Americans' blood, sweat, tears, and sacrificing their lives. They are our shaheeds, and yet we don't realize that every day the freedoms we have are specifically because of what African Americans have done in the courts, in the streets, in the classrooms, everywhere. As scientists, as builders.
ਜੈਦੀਪ ਜੀ, ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਹੋਰ ਡਿਟੇਲ ਵਿੱਚ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ, ਬਟ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਅੱਜ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਫਰਸਟ ਥਿੰਗ ਵੀ ਵਾਂਟ ਟੂ ਐਡਰੈਸ, the question I have for you is this: is race a biological fact, or is it a social construct, or even a political construct? Is it a biological fact?
It is not. Race is basically a very simple thing. It's a form of categorizing human beings based on completely arbitrary aspects of their appearance. So we refer to this, scholars, as phenotype, your appearance. That's all race is. There's nothing biological about it. There's nothing scientific about it. What it is a very important social construct. It has a very important political function. Race is a form of social hierarchy, like caste. It tells you who is at the top, who's at the bottom, and who's in every area in between. It's a social hierarchy. It's mapped onto human bodies. And it's enforced by coercion, meaning the law, the police, meaning if you move out of your neighborhood, people are going to put you back into it. And also by ideology, and that ideology is white supremacy.
Jaideep ji, it's very interesting. ਅਸੀਂ ਦੇਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ 2000 ਸਾਲ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਵੀ when some Greek philosophers are writing about the Africans, they don't call them people from some other race. They just say ki people from that place have a darker skin. I don't know how is it that over the period of time it became a different race altogether. Is there some history to that creation of the other?
Oh, absolutely. It goes back to the history of colonialism. I mean, I can talk about it in much more detail in the U.S. later.
Gee.
But, I mean, basically, think about it this way. If you're going to go to another country, kill the people, rape their women, steal their gold, and then make them your servants, like the British did in India, it's going to have an effect on people, right? It's going to mentally, it's going to affect them. That you can see in this country as you look around, and you see that all the beautiful and powerful people in this country are white. Sikhs come to this country and they start to realize very quickly that there is a racial hierarchy. My doctoral dissertation in the 1990s, I studied the 1998 cab strike in New York City. And I talked to the cab drivers, some of them who had just recently gotten off the Boeing. They had already learned and internalized these very powerful negative stereotypes of black people as they were driving around New York City. Even before they got to New York City, they had these notions of what black people were. So these ideas are certainly out there, and they affect all of us. Because where in the world are people the most likely to buy skin lightening cream so they can look, closer to white? Well, it's India, and it's been that way for a long time. So race has a very, it has a vast effect on who we are, how we perceive ourselves, and even how we live our lives. Sorry, that was a circuitous answer to your question.
No, Jaideep ji, I wonder, ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਚੀਜ਼ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਪੋਪੂਲਰਲੀ ਇਟਸ ਸੈਡ ਕਿ ਜਦ ਦੇਖੋ ਜੀ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦਾ ਇੱਕ ਬੜੀ ਓਲਡ ਸਿਵਲਾਈਜੇਸ਼ਨ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ, Vedas were written a long time back, Chinese have had a long, very old civilization, the Jewish people have had a very old civilization, Roman civilization. Africa ਵਾਸਤੇ ਕੀ ਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ we don't know if they ever had a civilization, just to show that inferiority, and we overlook these facts. ਸਾਡੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਇਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਲਿਆਏ ਜਾਂਦੇ. Now I have these names which I don't even know if I'm pronouncing them right because I've never heard them. The pharaoh Hatshepsut from 1507 BC. She was the most successful pharaoh amongst the Egyptians. She was a woman and a black woman. Nefertiti. ਅਸੀਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ religion ਜਿਹੜਾ as an organized thought was created in India amongst the Jewish people or Chinese people. Africa with 1500 saal pehle before Christ, there is this concept of God, the Aten, amongst ancient Egyptians. We have never heard of that. Mansa Musa in the 12th 13th century is known to be one of the richest men ever from Africa. Haven't heard much about that. Queen Nazinga, who fought the Portuguese from Angola. Again, this history we have not heard. ਇਹ ਕਿਆ ਸਾਡੇ ਤੋਂ by design ਸਾਡੇ ਤੋਂ ਦੂਰ ਰੱਖੀ ਗਈ ਹੈ just to show somebody's inferiority?
Well, that's the whole thing. We had to have, in order for slavery to be justified, there had to be a widespread recognition that blacks were inferior and whites were superior. Mm-hmm. And so this is still the basis, this white superiority, this white supremacy, to the point where it's infiltrated our minds to where the birthplace of civilization and of humanity, Africa, has been painted as some backward area. That's where all human beings came from. That's where the great ancient kingdoms of Kush, of Egypt, of Timbuktu, of ancient Ethiopia, these are all among the oldest civilizations. They're right up there with Sumeria, with ancient China, as well as Mohenjo-Daro. And newer research has shown that equally old civilizations were occurring in Central and South America. And so this is the whole reality. We've internalized, we've come to believe white supremacy. And that is the surest sign of a colonized people, people that have been conquered by other people. The other one is that if you worship a god that doesn't look like you, and if you look around the world and you start looking at that, you can start seeing where the colonized people were.
Jaideep ji, thanks for giving us some basic idea. What we take from this conversation so far is that there's nothing called race. By our religion, we taught manas ki jaat sabe eko pehchanbo, treat all human race as one. I don't know how other religions have informed the idea of race, but at least we take this much from the conversation with you, that it's not a biological fact. A male and a female is a biological fact. A dog and a cat is a biological fact. Different races amongst humans is not a biological fact. It's a social construct. जयदीप जी, ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲ ਜਾਰੀ ਰੱਖਾਂਗੇ ਇੱਕ ਛੋਟੀ ਜੀ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਰਹੋ ਦ ਵੇ ਫਾਰਵਰਡ। ਦ ਵੇ ਫਾਰਵਰਡ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਫਿਰ ਤੋਂ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਹੋਸਟ ਹਰਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ। ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ US ਵਿੱਚ ਰੇਸ ਦੀ, ਸਲੇਵਰੀ ਦੀ। ਜੈਦੀਪ ਜੀ, ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਤੇ ਜਾਣ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਕਲੀਅਰ ਕੀਤਾ ਕਿ ਜੋ ਰੇਸ ਹੈ ਇਹ ਇੱਕ ਕੋਈ ਬਾਇਓਲੋਜੀਕਲ ਫੈਕਟ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ, ਬਟ ਸਲੇਵਰੀ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਣ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਇਹ ਇੱਕ ਐਸਪੈਕਟ ਹੈ ਜਿਸ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਣਾ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਹੈ। And I think it has been created, just to ये colonialism है या slavery है, इसनू implement करने वास्ते, इसनू successful करने वास्ते this narrative had to be created. मैं थोड़े तो जानना चाहूँगा something which we hear as transatlantic slave trade. सानू please तुसी दसोगे।
Actually, Faji, could I talk a little bit more about race and what it means and why it's developed before we go to the trade?
Sure.
Slave trade.
जी.
So there's definitely a reason why race is, mapped onto human bodies and why there is an ideology behind it. Because even though it's utterly fictive, it determines who has access to the most desirable privileges in society. Who gets the best jobs? Who gets to live in the nicest neighborhoods? Who goes to the best schools? And so this utterly fictive concept is also thought to be linked. And this is the key here, with differing physical, intellectual, and moral characteristics. And that is the crux. That's the crux where race and racism can be used to treat people badly. And again, there's nothing biological about race. Because at the genetic level, race does not exist. Studies of human DNA have found there is more genetic variability between people within a racial group than within people between two different groups. So human coloration does tend to vary with latitude, how close you are to the equator. But skin color is not a reliable indicator of biological kinship. For example, I'll give you an example. Sub-Saharan Africans are actually more genetically similar to Europeans than to Melanesians in Australia, despite the fact both groups have dark hair and curly skin. But genetically, Africans are closer to Europeans.
Ji. So it's just a difference of pigmentation, they say, right?
Hanji?
It's just a difference of pigmentation, they say, the pigmentation in the skin.
Exactly, but it's not only that. It's arbitrary physical characteristics. The epicanthic fold for East Asians, curly hair for Africans, straight hair for Europeans, the color of hair and skin and eyes. I mean, these are arbitrary, meaningless things. Yet we assign so much value to them, and that is the crux of race and racism.
Ji. Jaideep ji, let's go to slave trade. Tanu dasoge ki siga transatlantic slave trade?
So the slave trade, to put it briefly, was a way in which Europeans essentially took Africans from Africa, involving certain members of African nations within the trade, and they basically paid for the Industrial Revolution that way. I mean, the wealth that was created, it's mind-boggling. It's astronomical. And I think that's one of the main things we have to try to understand when we talk about this, is that slavery of Africans, it laid the foundation for the modern world economic system. Not just in the United States, not just England, the entire world.
Jaideep ji, we'll go deep. We'll dive deeper into that later. मैं थोड़े तो ये समझना चाहूँगा. It's around 1607 that the first we have these people arriving from England in Jamestown, Virginia. right, around 1607. And, a decade after they come, they bring indentured, they create this indentured servitude. ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹ ਸਰਵੈਂਟਸ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਏ, ਔਰ ਉਹ ਸਰਵੈਂਟਸ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇਨੀਸ਼ੀਅਲੀ ਉਹ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਏ ਮੋਸਟਲੀ ਯੂਰਪ ਤੋਂ, ਜੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਲੜਾਈਆਂ ਚੱਲਦੀ ਪਈ ਸਨ, ਅਨਇੰਪਲੋਇਮੈਂਟ ਸੀਗੀ. It's around 1619, I believe, that the first people were brought from Africa, right?
Yes.
ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਕੁਝ 15-20 ਸਾਲ as indentured servitude ਵਿੱਚ ਰੱਖਿਆ ਗਿਆ. Indentured servitude for our viewers would be like ਬੰਦਵਾ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰ, but not slave. ਤੇ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ transition ਹੈ from indentured servitude, ਬੰਦਵਾ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ to slavery, ਇਸ ਦੀ ਕੀ ਵਜ੍ਹਾ ਹੈ?
So that's a really important point. Now, initially, the big inducement to come to North America was land. That's it. If there wasn't land, they wouldn't come. This explains why people from England came to horrible New England with terrible weather and didn't go to the Bahamas or the Caribbean, because the land in those tiny islands quickly ran out. New England, however, and the rest of the colonies had vast inducements of land. So land was what brought them here. Now, oh boy, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, what were we What was your question? I'm sorry.
No, so we were talking ki indentured servitude to slavery.
That's sorry.
Yeah.
So now, initially there was no slavery. All workers, and again, the great inducement was land. But people didn't want to stay as workers. So they quickly, as soon as their indenture ran out, it was 4 to 6 years normally, you'd be given a portion of land. Now, the problem was the rich, as they often are, were greedy. And so by the 1860s and the 1660s and 1670s, you started to see servants, both black and white, running away together, having rebellions together. And the biggest one was in 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. Now, this many historians point to as the birth of the modern concept of race. So, 100 years before the birth of America. Basically, it was a rebellion, Bacon's Rebellion, in which black and white indentured servants marauded and rampaged together through the countryside. And the aftermath of this, laws were immediately passed to harden the condition, to separate black and white people. Before, they were marrying together, they were working together, they were fighting together. The ruling class had to end this. And when you started to see a hard and fast notion of white meaning free and black meaning slave. And so it was at this point that laws started to be passed after Bacon's Rebellion that really started to harden the line, where you no longer saw black people as indentured servants. Black eventually came to mean enslaved, while white meant free.
ਆਹੀ ਗੱਲ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਐਮਫਸਾਈਜ਼ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ. ਸਾਡੇ ਵਿਊਅਰਸ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਣ ਦੀ ਇਹ ਲੋੜ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਅੱਜ ਤੋਂ 2000 ਸਾਲ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਵੀ, ਜਦ ਆਪਾਂ ਇਜਿਪਸ਼ੀਅਨ ਸਿਵਲਾਈਜੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰੀਏ, ਉੱਥੇ ਕਈ ਬਲੈਕਸ ਹੈਗੇ, ਕਈ ਵਾਈਟਸ ਹੈਗੇ, ਮਿਕਸ ਹੈਗੇ. ਇਟ ਇਜ਼ ਨਾਟ ਅ ਕਨਸੈਪਟ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਰੇਸ ਦਾ ਕਨਸੈਪਟ ਹੈ. ਪੀਪਲ ਆਰ ਡਿਫਰੈਂਟ, ਪੀਪਲ ਹੈਵ ਡਿਫਰੈਂਟ ਕਲਰਸ, ਬਟ ਦੇयर इज नो ਕਨਸੈਪਟ ਆਈਡੈਂਟੀਫਾਈਂਗ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਕਿਸ ਰੇਸ ਦਾ ਹੈ. ਉੱਦਾਂ ਹੀ ਇਹ ਜਦ ਇਨੀਸ਼ੀਅਲੀ ਇਹ ਸਰਵਿਟਿਊਡ ਵੀ ਚੱਲਦਾ ਹੈ, ਉਹਦੇ ਵਾਈਟਸ ਵੀ ਹੈਗੇ, ਬਲੈਕਸ ਵੀ ਹੈਗੇ, ਬਟ ਦੈਨ ਸਮਥਿੰਗ ਹੈਡ ਟੂ ਬੀ ਡਨ, ਸਮਥਿੰਗ ਹੈਡ ਟੂ ਹੈਪਨ ਵਿਚ ਕ੍ਰੀਏਟਿਡ ਦ ਡਿਫਰੈਂਸ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਵਾਈਟ ਹੈਗੇ, ਇਹ ਬਲੈਕਸ ਹੈਗੇ, ਔਰ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਬਲੈਕਸ ਹਨ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਨਫੀਰੀਅਰ ਦਿਖਾਉਣ ਵਾਸਤੇ, just because ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਰੂਡੀਅਰਡ ਕਿਪਲਿੰਗ ਦੀ ਉਹ ਪੋਇਮ ਸੀਗੀ ਵਾਈਟ ਮੈਨਸ ਬਰਡਨ, ਯੂ ਹੈਵ ਟੂ ਸ਼ੋ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵਾਈਟ ਹੈਗਾ ਉਸਦੀ ਕੁਛ ਇੱਕ ਸੁਪੀਰੀਅਰਿਟੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਓਵਰ ਦ ਅਦਰਸ. ਇਜ਼ ਦੈਟ ਫੇਅਰ ਟੂ ਸੇ?
Absolutely. And when we talk about slavery, we can't ignore Indians, because American Indians were initially the primary source of income. So basically, they set up all these colonies. You're talking about Jamestown. All these colonies that were set up, they were financially a burden. They had to continue to send money and food from the homeland. That defeats the purpose of having a colony. A colony, as in India, is to extract wealth. Slavery solved this problem. The early colonists basically sustained themselves through Indian slavery. So this is exactly who they were. It wasn't that they started with blacks. Eventually, they depopulated the Indians. There's another major problem. If you're trying to hold someone a slave on land that's more theirs than yours, they're going to run away and you won't catch them. And that was increasingly a problem. There was depopulation, the genocidal elimination of entire tribes because of the slave trade. But also the fact that Indians could get away and run away. And so I mean, slavery really is kind of the basis of what this nation has always been. It wasn't just African slavery that built the United States. Before the United States, when it was a colony, it was Indian slavery that enabled the maintenance of these colonies. Otherwise, they would have just disappeared into the wilderness again. It was only Indian slavery that made them profitable.
So there was like initially 104 people who came, representing a company. So they needed these low paid workers for their the whole effort to be profitable. That's the reason behind, right?
Yeah, if I could talk for a couple minutes about, I don't know if this is the time, but I mean, just how dependent European life was on slavery. So this exploitation dictated the very structure of Euro-American society. As I mentioned earlier, slavery of Africans laid the foundation for the modern world economic system. The massive infrastructure required to move 10 million Africans halfway around the world, it built entire cities in England and France, like Liverpool, Manchester, Bordeaux. These cities are creations of the slave trade. It was London's emergence as a global center of capital that spurred New York's rise as a center of finance. For every dollar generated by cotton, 40% ended up in New York City. So this is cotton picked by slaves, grown in the South. 40 cents of it for every dollar came to New York City. So New York was very much a product of slavery. And I have a great deal of information. We can talk about that later. But I just want to give you just some very general stuff. So Northerners, I think it's very important to understand, were deeply implicated in the Southern enterprise because of the ship. Hanji.
ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਜਾਰੀ ਰੱਖਾਂਗੇ ਇੱਕ ਛੋਟੀ ਜੀ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਰਹੋ ਦ ਵੇ ਫਾਰਵਰਡ ਦ ਵੇ ਫਾਰਵਰਡ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਫਿਰ ਤੋਂ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਹੋਸਟ ਹਰਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੈਦੀਪ ਜੀ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਤੇ ਜਾਣ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸਣਾ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀਗਾ ਕਿ ਨਿਊਯਾਰਕ ਦਾ ਕੀ ਰੋਲ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਇਸ ਸਾਰੇ ਸਲੇਵ ਟ੍ਰੇਡ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕ ਜਨਰਲ ਫੀਲਿੰਗ ਲੋਕੀ ਲੈਂਦੇ ਨੇ ਕਿ ਬਈ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇਹ ਸਲੇਵਰੀ ਹੈ ਇਹ ਕੋਈ ਸਾਊਥ ਦਾ ਕੋਈ ਫਿਨੋਮੀਨਨ ਹੈਗਾ ਨਾਰਥ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈ ਦੇ ਹੈਵ ਕੈਪਟ ਦੈਮਸੈਲਵਸ ਅਵੇ ਫਰਮ ਦਿਸ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸੋਗੇ ਕੀ ਰੋਲ ਰਿਹਾ ਨਿਊਯਾਰਕ ਦਾ ਪਰਟੀਕੂਲਰਲੀ ਇਸ ਸਾਰੇ ਫਿਨੋਮੀਨਾ ਵਿੱਚ
Yeah, so I was discussing how Northerners were deeply implicated in the Southern enterprise of slavery through shipping, insurance, financing, and for every dollar generated by the Southern cotton, 40 cents ended up in New York City. The industry to construct, fund, staff, and administer the thousands of ships, which made close to 50,000 individual voyages alone, was a Herculean task. I mean, it's mind-boggling. 50,000 individual voyages. And again, they were all very closely monitored and very, very well cataloged because this is money, right? These human beings were property, and they kept track of every single piece of their property. Now, the international financial and distribution networks required to coordinate, maintain, and profit from slavery, they set the framework for the modern global economy. So what I mean by that is the networks that they used to send the slaves to their various sites was then later used by capitalist organizations, by corporations, to send other goods. So it was slaves that initiated these trade routes. So in that sense, you can understand what I mean when I say that slavery launched modern capitalism. Okay, it suddenly made the U.S. into the world's wealthiest nation. Now, the way we are taught history in this country is that it was American exceptionalism. Americans are supermen. But no. What it was free African labor. And it was the commerce in African human bodies that made America incredibly wealthy in such a short time. Now, talking about complicity, we have this mythology in this country that pretends that the white planter was evil. And the London merchant, right, they were evil because they grew rich on the profits of slave labor. And that the poor white in the South and the northern small farmer and white workers, they were all involved in slavery and did not benefit from it. The mythology even suggests that slavery lowered the standard of living of the white masses by holding down their wages. Okay, because if you can't compete against slave labor, right, so it's going to depress wages. So thus it's alleged that slavery was not in the interests of the white masses, but that's not true. Probably the most important scholar, intellectual of the 1900s, of the 1800s, was Karl Marx. Unfortunately, in this country, we don't read him, and thus we don't really understand any criticisms of capitalism. So Karl Marx observed that if you cause slavery to disappear, you will have wiped America off off the map of nations. Now, Marx was actually writing during the low point of the cotton economy in the mid-1800s. But this basic fact is true from the very beginnings of European settlement in America. And I mentioned that earlier, that there would have been no colonies if it wasn't for Indian slavery. Okay, because now, so without slave labor, there would be no America. It's as simple as that. Now, first of all, until the Civil War, the greatest amount of wealth in the US was in the ownership of slaves and of slave labor. When we look in the United States today, where the greatest concentrations of wealth, of course, Manhattan, right? Silicon Valley, Los Angeles. During this time, the richest people in the United States were in fact in the Mississippi River Valley, a town called Natchez, Mississippi, long since, dilapidated. But you look at the mansions there. It was the Mississippi Valley that was the Silicon Valley of that time period. Mm-hmm. So these were the richest Americans. They ran the country. Almost all the first 15 presidents were from the South. So slavery, it was the enterprise of America. It created America, it made them rich, and almost every single person was complicit. So let me talk a little bit about New York City. Now, long before the cotton economy of the South flourished, so this is way before slavery, African slaves built the city of New York. It was their work that enabled the original Dutch settlers, right? You have Bedford-Stuyvesant, you have these Dutch names. Those Dutch settlers, it was the work of Africans that enabled the Dutch to be fed and sheltered while they pursued their activities, leisure activities, drinking, gambling, and some fur trading. Africans were not only much of early New York's farmers, but their carpenters, their blacksmiths, and the city's guards. They did all the work. They built everything. So you were speaking earlier about Africans and the lack of skills that we perceive that they have. That's our white supremacy that we've internalized. As a matter of fact, Africans were brought from certain areas to the South specifically because of their skills. I think it was in South Carolina, there were these islands. The skill Africans had in planting rice and raising rice, they were specifically targeted by the slave masters because they wanted people with those skills. So, that's one of the biggest fallacies, that these were unskilled people. These were people who came from advanced societies. These are ancient societies. They had tremendous skills, woodworking, metalworking. So, I think there's a lot of stuff. I'm sorry, let me go back to New York. I keep getting distracted. So, Africans, they did a lot of the early work. Now, the Dutch settlers, they were so dependent on African labor in New York for the basics of life that the governor of the early Dutch colony of New York finally granted some African slaves both freedom and land as long as they would continue to produce food for the whites. Mm-hmm. Now, the African-owned land in Manhattan at one time included Greenwich Village, Astor Place, and Herald Square. Those were all Black-owned. Now, later, after the Dutch left, the English came, right? The English displaced them. The English settlers, after taking land from the Dutch, they immediately passed laws that banned African land ownership. And so they took these tracts of land from free Africans. So if you think about it, Manhattan was actually stolen twice from oppressed people. Actually, maybe 3 times, because have you ever heard of Seneca Village? It was a little black, all black village in what is now Central Park. When they decided to build Central Park as the city was expanding and moving northward, they cleared out the black village. So that's 3 times that just in New York, in Manhattan, that the land was stripped from oppressed people. Now let me talk a little bit more about African-American skills. I'm sorry, Africans' skills. Their economic skills were a leading reason for their enslavement. Africans possessed unique expertise which Europeans required to make their colonial ventures successful. For example, Africans knew how to grow and cultivate crops in tropical and semi-tropical climates. African rice growers were captured in order to bring their agricultural knowledge to America's sea islands and those of the Caribbean. Many West African civilizations possessed goldsmiths and expert metalworkers on a grand scale. And you can see this if you go and look at some of the amazing gold work. Now, this is not a country of jungles and backward people and lions and tigers. Isn't that what racists say about India too? So I think, Punjabis and Sikhs, we have to be a lot more, I think, astute intellectually and look at the lies that racists say about people of color.
So Jaideep ji, let me ask you this. We know those words by David Hume that these Africans, they are inferior people because they have no government, they have no skills, they have no manufacturing, they have never had all these things in the civilization. So is that a blatant lie?
That's what we're talking about. White supremacy is a series of blatant lies.
Gee.
And it's not only about the superiority of whiteness, but the inferiority of Indians, of Chinese, of blacks, of Native Americans, of Malays. Right? I mean, that's the whole notion.
Gee.
So, a couple more things. So, many Africans, as I mentioned, they had goldsmiths and expert metalworkers. These slaves were snatched to work in Spanish and Portuguese gold and silver mines throughout Central and South America. Contrary to the myth of unskilled labor, large numbers of Africans were anything but. That's why they were such a profitable and valuable labor force. African labor and African know-how transformed slave economies and slave societies into some of the wealthiest on the planet, funding the growth of global empires. Now, the greatest source of wealth for imperial France, for example, right? For us, it was cotton. For France, it was the white gold of sugars produced by the Africans who were taken to Haiti. More riches flowed to Britain from the slave economy of Jamaica than all of the original 13 colonies combined. That's what I was talking about earlier.
Yeah,
you have a colony to get money. They got more money out of that tiny island Jamaica than all of the 13 colonies. That's amazing.
जयदीप जी, मैं for our viewers मैं एक चीज़ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਤੋਂ ਦੁਬਾਰਾ ਪੁੱਛਣਾ ਚਾਹਾਂਗਾ कि ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਾਰੇ skills के ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ, is that something जो in slaves ने they picked up while working as slaves for these white people, or these are skill sets they brought from Africa when they were brought here?
There are very much skill sets they brought from Africa, but they also learned a great deal from whites. If you go to New Orleans today, into the French Quarter, which is the oldest part of the city, any iron work you see on those balconies, those lamps, anything you see in the old French Quarter, if it's original, it was made by slaves. Because at that point, during slavery, one of the ways in which people could make the most money, I'm sorry, I'm having a little computer mistakes. My computer came unplugged. Okay, sorry.
Great. Jaideep, I'll give you time to adjust that screen. We'll come back after a short break. ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਰਹੋ The Way Forward. The Way Forward ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਫਿਰ ਤੋਂ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਹੋਸਟ ਹਰਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ। ਜੈਦੀਪ ਜੀ, ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਦੇ ਦੌਰਾਨ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕੁਝ ਐਸੇ ਕੁਆਰਟਰਸ ਦੀ ਕੰਪਲਿਸਿਟੀ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਸੀਗੇ which we don't generally feel ਕਿ ਉਹ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਨਵੋਲਵਡ ਹੋਣਗੇ. You're talking about some universities, you're talking about the founding fathers, some popular presidents. ਸਾਨੂੰ ਪਲੀਜ਼ ਥੋੜਾ ਵਿਸਤਾਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਦੱਸ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ ਸਾਡੇ viewers ਨੂੰ?
Well, we're talking about white supremacy, and I wanted to give you a quote from a United States president, Theodore Roosevelt. He wrote in 1900, quote, "The settler and the pioneer have at bottom had justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages." So this is exactly the type of language you hear when you talk about blacks and Indians throughout this period. And you can come even 200 years further to 1900 when the first Sikhs started coming here, and they said very similar things about Sikhs. Sikhs were inferior, Sikhs were dirty, Sikhs were backwards. They said an awful lot about our turbans. The turban was really something racists focused on. But I think it's important for us as immigrants of color to understand that this type of thing has been happening to all people of color throughout this nation's history. That's the reality of our history in this country.
ਜੀ ਜੈਦੀਪ ਜੀ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਯੂਨੀਵਰਸਿਟੀਜ਼ ਦੀ ਕੰਪਲਿਸਿਟੀ ਬਾਰੇ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਸੀ, ਉਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਕੁਝ ਦੱਸ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ?
Sure. Well, I mean, can I talk a little bit more before we do about basically the deep complicity of people in New York City? Because I mentioned how slavery underwrote the Industrial Revolution and the vast improvements in Western Europe's economic infrastructure. So in that period, the Industrial Revolution is really when Europe moved ahead of Asia in a lot of ways. The reason it did that was the trillions of dollars in slave money. That was the only difference. That was the reason. I think that's the main thing we have to understand is the way the United States and Europe took quantum leaps forward was out of slave money. Universities. So, I mean, I think one of the things we have to understand is that every single, I mean, I have great details about this, but I want to keep it short. I mean, people like companies like New York Life, right? It was a minor company until someone had the brilliant idea of taking slaves, which it's an inherently dangerous venture, because if a slave dies, and that can happen in many ways, right? Overwork, you could beat them to death, and of course there's disease. If that person dies, then all that investment money is gone. But some brilliant insurance company person found a way to make it a lot easier for the slave owners to make more and more money and to be less involved, to make it a less risky venture. What that did was create incredible wealth in New York City. I mean, people don't realize that in New York City had the second biggest slave market in the entire continental United States. That wall of Wall Street was built literally to separate the financial market from the slave market. Downtown on Wall Street was where the slave market was. And this was the second biggest slave market in North America. And so slavery was not some type of southern thing. Slavery was all over New York City.
Yeah,
it wasn't just that it was...
The first state that legalized slavery was Massachusetts in 1641. So it's not just a southern phenomena.
Absolutely.
Jaideep ji, we talk of slavery or ਅਸੀਂ ਸੋਚਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ it was a bad time, but I think our imagination does not go that far to visualize what were the excesses against the black people who were held as slaves. Can you throw some light on that?
Well, yeah, let me put it this way. So Punjabis are generally a rural people. And many of us come from a background in which we have tremendous reliance not only on the land, but on the animals that we have on that land. So could you imagine a human being taking their oxen and beating the oxen until it was dead? Right? I mean, it couldn't happen, right? I mean, it's beyond comprehension that a Punjabi would do that type of barbarity. But that was regularly practiced with slaves. And there's a reason for that barbarity and that brutality and that violence was because they ran away. Right? Despite all the lies, there's this mythology about how slaves were happy. They were contented. Right? That's what the masters said. If you actually read the master's slave diaries, the slave master's diaries, they were terrified of a bloody revolt in which someone would cut their throats in the middle of the night. This was accelerated in 1781 when Haiti was born, the only country born of a slave rebellion. And from that time on, if you look at even Thomas Jefferson, the letters he wrote to some of his fellow slave owners, they were terrified of what happened in Haiti would happen to them. And slave rebellions happened throughout American history again and again and again. And they happened on the slave ships as well. So this was the understanding. Anyone who had a slave understood that they could wake up in the middle of the night with a blade to their throat. So they did everything they could to make sure that never happened. They wanted to put the fear of God and everything else in between them into their slaves. And so they did it. They did it with brutality, with violence, with sexual violence, by separating families, by punishing them in any way they could, the most brutal, barbaric types of torture. But they could get away with it because this person was less than a cow is in Punjab today. Because you can't replace your oxen very easily, but you can replace slaves. So, I know that's a pretty horrific way to make it, I think, plain, but that's the reality. Anything you could possibly imagine that a human being could do to another person was done. And it was done with no repercussions because they weren't human beings. If you raped someone, you weren't raping a person. That was your property. If you cut someone's hand off, there was no repercussion. The law said that was your property. It's like your He-Man doll. You can do whatever you want to it.
ਸਾਡੇ viewers ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਸਮਝਣਾ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ these people, the black people brought from Africa, they were not even treated as full human beings. They were treated as property. You could sell them as property. You could sell and buy them as property. They had no rights at all. And Jaideep ji, we have heard a lot about...
And they kept them that way. To keep them that way, if you learned how to read, they'd kill you. If you had a weapon, they'd kill you. If you organized a meeting, they'd kill you. It's... Right?
ਜੀ 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 ਔਰ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਫੇਅਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ 'ਚ ਇੰਸਟਿਲ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸੀ this they started right when they started the journey from Africa. There horrendous stories about those passages as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean it's mind-boggling
जी.
to put that many human beings in the bottom of a ship, sitting in their own filth. There's no bathroom.
जी.
So for 2-3 weeks, you're sitting in the filth of the people behind you, the vomit, the filth, the sickness. When someone died, they'd throw them overboard. Now, one of the most common things that would happen on these ships was slave rebellions.
Mm-hmm.
And if a rebellion were to occur, sometimes they would get free, but otherwise, they would throw the bodies over the shore, over the ship's head. And what's crazy is the sharks in the Atlantic learned to start following slave ships because they knew that these ships would eventually be throwing corpses overboard. So throwing, human property over the side was very much a part of this whole Middle Passage, regardless of the weeks of torture that took human lives and drove people crazy. Mm-hmm. There was also the fact that, they also died. And the mortality rate was crazy. If they say approximately 15 million people made it to the United States. Mm-hmm. They say for every African that made it here, 4 or 5 of them died in the Middle Passage. So that's 60 to 75 million Africans that were stolen and depopulated from the continent of Africa.
जी 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 जयदीप जी प्रेसिडेंट लिंकन दे टाइम ये स्लेवरी ख़त्म की जाती है यू थिंक एक जनरल कोई रिमोर्स की फीलिंग है और देयर अदर रीजंस फॉर दैट Why was the slavery abolished across the country?
Well, it started in other places. England abolished slavery much earlier than we did.
Gee.
And as a matter of fact, I think it was 1775, the year before the United States became a country. And that was actually the reason the United States became a country. Now, remember how I told you how the richest people in the United States were in the South? Mm-hmm. If you're that rich, would you want to leave colonial Britain when you're the richest people in the world almost? Mm-hmm. So for the longest time, people in the South did not want to fight in the Revolution. What convinced them to fight in the Revolution was in 1775 a British court case that outlawed slavery. They believed that the British would then extend that case to apply to them. And so out of fear of losing everything they'd built up, they then and only then supported the cause of revolution. So, I mean, slavery was the basis of almost every single thing. There's no remorse. It's not about that. It's about money. It's about capitalism. Capitalism and racism are hand in hand, and they need each other. Because in capitalism, only a tiny minority can do well. So when the vast majority is going to be screwed over and treated like the cab drivers we see in the streets who are literally suffering and committing suicide because of what's happening with medallions in New York City, we have to have a way to distinguish and say these people deserve to be poor. These people, because they're black, we deserve to treat them that way. Because they're from India or because they're immigrants, they deserve to have the worst jobs in this country. And that's when everything starts to make sense. Because nothing about race makes any sense at all. It's insane. Mm-hmm. The shape of my eye should dictate, or if I have straight hair should dictate my mental qualities or my how I treat people.
जयदीप जी सानू ये हिस्टोरिकल कॉन्टैक्स्ट दसन दे वास्ते थोड़ा बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया साडे व्यूअर्स नू ये समझण दी लोड़ है कि जो अज दा वो प्रेजेंट यूएस देखते हैं और अज दी जो कंडीशन देखते हैं अमंगस्ट ब्लैक कम्यूनिटी इज़ इन यूएस उसकी कुछ हिस्टोरिकल वजह हैं और वो जड़ी वजह वो 1865-66 खत्म नहीं होंदियां इस स्लेवरी का जो आफ्टर मैथ है और रिकनस्ट्रक्शन का पीरियड और जिम क्रो एंड एवरीथिंग उसके बारे विच भी गल करना जरूरी है अज समा इजाजत नहीं देंदा असी तुहाडे नाल ये गल जारी रखांगे असी तुहानूं रिक्वेस्ट करांगे अगले हफ्ते असी ये जिहड़ी साडी डिस्कशन है इसनूं जारी रखांगे अज साडे नाल गल करन दा बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया
Birji, my pleasure. As a matter of fact, so let me give you a little bit of preview. So slavery ended in 1861. The Civil War ended in 1865. Gee. Historians of U.S. history and race generally agree that the worst time for African Americans in U.S. history was 1900. So that's 35 years after the Civil War. And we can talk about that next week.
Jaideep ji, that's very important. That's very important for our viewers to know. ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਜਾਰੀ ਰੱਖਾਂਗੇ ਅਗਲੇ ਹਫਤੇ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਰਹੋ The Way Forward।